All right, sir. And you can just look at me. First thing that Tim asked me to ask you is, how did you? Let me ask you again. Um, when did? Tell me when you enlisted.
Uh, I was in high school in 1941 when Pearl Harbor enlisted, and we all rushed down and enlisted. But I didn't leave until after graduation. I was 17 years old then.
Wow. So you enlisted while you were still in high school.
Yes,
Were you and your other classmates doing the same thing?
pretty much everybody wanted to go. We were afraid we'd miss it if we didn't hurry, and so we all wanted to get in.
And when you did went in, how did you wind up becoming a medic?
I volunteered for the paratroops when I went through the induction center at Monterey. And when I got down, I volunteered for the paratroops, and they sent me to Georgia. And the major that was in charge of the medical detachment selected me to be a medic. And that's where I started my medical practice.
Because typically a medic is a non-combatant in combat, isn't he?
Well, initially we didn't carry a weapon. Later we did, but in Normandy we didn't have a weapon.
And could you tell me a little bit about? Tell me about the training that you went through. Since you started in four, you were, I guess, training for a year and a half or 2 years.
We
before.
took basic training in Toccoa, Georgia, up in the northern part of Georgia in the wintertime, and it was very violent training. It was very, very rough. They washed out about 3 for every one that stayed there. And then we went to the parachute school and made our 5 qualifying jumps at parachute school, and then we went to North Carolina for advanced infantry training. And we went on Tennessee maneuvers, which was an interesting experience. And then we got a furlough, and after furlough, we went overseas.
And let me ask you a little bit more about the training. Like you had to go through paratrooper training before you trained for infantry.
No, basic training was infantry training with a parachute sideline, and then after the parachute school, we went to advanced infantry training in North Carolina, and I think that was 3 or 4 months there. That was in the summertime in North Carolina. It was hotter than Hades, and we did lots of long marches and field exercises.
Let me ask you, why did you want to choose the paratroops?
It sounded glamorous, extra $50, and parachute boots attracted the girls, so we thought that was pretty neat. And we didn't realize that we were going to be expected to jump out of an airplane. That never entered my mind.
Well, may I ask you, what was that first jump like?
It was very frightening. These people nowadays are doing jumps just for fun, but it wasn't any fun making military jumps in 1942. That was the start of the parachute infantry concept. So we were the guinea pigs.
And I have done some skydiving myself when I was young, and I jumped in using a 1950s Army surplus parachute, much like the ones that you had with no direction and stuff like that. What was like?
Did you have a static line or free fall? Huh?
Static? Yeah, you hooked up.
Yeah.
Uh, what was it like jumping out of a plane and then after you have that initial kind of thump where it catches, and then just being up in the sky with all of the other men. Because one thing I know, reason I asked it is that when I jumped out of a plane, one thing that got me was how quiet it was.
Yeah, it was very quiet and very exhilarating. It was a high, I guess the closest thing you can connect it to would be sex. But no, it was really an exhilarating experience once you got out the door.
One thing that I noticed was that they say that sound travels up, and you really could hear what was on the ground.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the guys down there on the ground, we had trucks down there waiting for us. You could hear them talking. And we didn't, we weren't high enough to get much of a ride. We started out 1,200 feet, and then by the time we got to combat, we were down to 700. And in the Normandy jump, I was the 18th man in the aircraft, and by the time I got out, I think we were down to about 300 feet. My parachute just barely opened, and I landed in the water.
Yeah, because it takes at least 200 or 250 feet for your chute to open.
Right.
That just breaks your fall.
Yeah, I got my opening shock and looked around, and I was down. I was down. It wasn't any ride at all.
Well, let me backtrack a little bit. Was there any other specific things about the training that you went through that sticks out in your mind?
Well, they made us go as far as we could go, and then a little farther. We had our NCOs and our officers were all very vigorous guys, and they really wrung us out. We did things that we didn't think we were capable of.
Because when you started, you were 17 and then turning 18. As a young man, it must have been an entirely different thing from what you ever expected.
Oh, there's nothing to compare it to. By the time we got through basic training, we were all in really good shape. I was a big, skinny kid, but we made 2 25-mile marches in just over 5 hours. And that took all that we had.
I guess it gave you a new respect for gym class from high school.
Sure did. Yeah.
Yes. With how long were you in England before?
Oh, we got there in the winter of '43. We were there about 6 months, I think.
Well, that's a long time. Were you doing
in June? We jumped in Normandy in June.
Were you doing any kind of special training?
We made 2 night jumps and lots of field problems, mainly to give the officers training in controlling large groups of men.
How many jumps in all did you do before the Normandy jump?
Oh gosh, I guess Normandy's about my 10th.
It doesn't sound like very many.
No, I didn't do any voluntarily. I didn't enjoy parachute jumping at all. It wasn't fun. They loaded us up with 150 pounds of equipment, and you land like a sack of potatoes with all that stuff hanging off of you.
I have to do a quick check here. The weeks and days leading up to D-Day, when you were all in the camps and there was all of the big buildup going on in England, do you have any memories of that going on, and kind of the build-up, the anticipation that it was getting close?
We realized that we were going to be the tip of the spear when the invasion came, and we were all anticipating how we would react to people being shooting at us, and so it was a time of a good deal of tension.
Yeah, because up to this point you had not faced a combat situation.
No, there's no substitute for having somebody trying to kill you.
Did you notice, was the buildup visible in those last few weeks?
Oh, yeah. England was loaded to with equipment and troops. We laughed and said the only thing that kept the island up were the barrage balloons.
When did at what point did they tell you when it was going to happen and where you were going to go, what your job was going to be?
We got briefed for a couple of missions before D-Day, and then for the actual invasion, it was about 2 days before the invasion that they showed us the sand tables and gave us the briefings and told us what to expect.
Mm-hmm. Make a minor adjustment here. And when you saw what you were going to be coming up against, what were your thoughts? I mean, especially since, did you realize when you first signed up for the paratroops that you're going to be going in ahead of everybody else and going into occupied territory?
No, as a young kid, a high school kid, you don't think about, you don't think it through. You volunteer for stuff and you don't realize what you're getting into, and you don't realize the seriousness of the situation.
Do you remember, because I know they were originally going to go on June 5th, and then it was canceled. Do you remember the canceling?
Yeah, we had a big build-up. Our commanding officer gave us a big speech, and then there was a stand down for 24 hours. They gave us, we were in a marshalling area. We were sealed in there. You couldn't get out. And they gave us a wonderful meal. We had steak and eggs and stuff that was unheard of in our mess halls.
And so did you get that twice since it was set up once? Or
Yeah, we had it for 2 days.
And then when they told you that it was finally going to happen, what was the mood like that, all right, this is it, you're going to have to...
Excitement. We were all geared up. And our commanding officer was a wild man. And he gave us a very enthusiastic speech. And this is what we'd been training for, and we were ready to go. And he convinced us that before the sun came up, we should kill 4 or 5 Germans each.
What did you think when you heard words like that?
We were excited. We responded. He was a very dynamic leader, and he had been training us now for 1.5 years. And we had excellent company grade officers and NCOs. We were probably as good as any unit in the Army at that time. And we were ready to go. And he got us really geared up the afternoon before we loaded in the planes.
Right. I'm going to pause it again here for just a moment. The ride over and the landing. Do you have any memories of that?
Yes, I looked out the door and saw all the boats headed for France, and England had double summertime, and it was still fairly light. We could see the English Channel as we were going across, and so it looked encouraging. We weren't alone.
And then, once you got overland, what do you remember about when they told you it's time to, on your feet, hook up, and jumping out? Do you remember any of that and going into the dark?
The Air Force had the hotshots in the Air Force wound up fighter pilots, and the guys that weren't quite that geared up became bomber pilots, and the guys that weren't really hot at all, they put them in troop carrier. So we had these 19-year-olds, because they were the same as us. They were just young kids, and they'd never been shot at before. So when we made landfall across the channel, the Germans were waiting for us. They had been expecting us the night before, and they were all ready with all their anti-aircraft artillery, and they shot us up. Took a few minutes to come across the peninsula, and we dropped behind the D-Day beaches. So we were maybe 5 minutes of just solid anti-aircraft fire. Rifle fire could hit us at that altitude. So we were really anxious to get out of that airplane. And I think the number is somewhere around 60 aircraft didn't make it back to England. But we were really anxious to get out of that airplane, and the excitement was you can't imagine how tense everybody was. It was amazing.
And then, do you remember where you landed and where you I think you were supposed to go to Drop Zone D.
I landed on Drop Zone D. The Germans had flooded it, and it didn't show up on the aerial photographs, but it was flooded from the Douve River, and there was about 3 feet of water where I landed. And so that cushioned my landing shock. And I got out of my parachute, and before we loaded in the planes, a friend of mine asked me where my weapon was, and I told him I didn't have a weapon. And he said, "Well, here, take this," and he gave me a hand grenade. So I put the hand grenade in my pocket. And after I got out of my parachute, I pulled the hand grenade out, and I heard a commotion in the next field. The fields were all bounded by hedgerows, and I heard a commotion in the next field, so I went over to peek over the top, and there's a cow over there. But I'm standing here with a live hand grenade. I'd pulled a pin out on it. So I carried that around for about half an hour before I found a place to throw it.
When you arrived in Angoville, what was going on there?
There was a lot of fighting, a lot of rifle fire, a lot of Germans around there. And we came up out of the swamp to the high ground there at Angoville, where the church was. And so by the time the sun came up, there was maybe 150 of us in that vicinity. And there were God knows how many Germans, but there was a lot of rifle fire, a lot of firing going on.
And how did you end up in the church?
We had 2 doctors in each battalion, and there's a medical section, 3 medical aid men in each rifle company. And the way they scattered us on the drop, neither of our doctors showed up. So Bob Wright and I were the only 2 medics that assembled in this area around the church at Angoville. So we started rounding up the drop casualties and gunfire and shrapnel casualties, and putting them in the church. And the ones that weren't mobile, we laid them out in the pews, and we had some old parachute silk. We covered them up with parachute silk, and there's still some blood stains in the pews there at Angoville.
And so, did you know Robert Wright beforehand?
Yeah, we had trained together. He's a stocky little guy. He lives in Florida now. And he's had a stroke, so he's lost a good deal of his awareness, or whatever you'd call it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pause it here for a second. All right. All right. As it says, the Germans were using the church steeple as an observation point, and nobody knew about it. Is that true?
Yeah, we didn't realize that there were a couple of krauts up in the attic there in the steeple, and they stayed up there. Didn't come down till the next day. And they were just a couple of kids. They were scared.
So they were hiding, or were they calling back to their?
I think they were just hiding up there. I don't think they had a radio or anything.
What was it like when you found out that the whole day that you were there that you had Germans just above?
We just laughed. It was kind of funny.
Did they give themselves up, or were they found, or what?
I don't remember. I just remember seeing him sitting out in front of the church, and they were being interviewed.
Let's see. The fighting at Angoville broke out at daybreak. Now, what was the situation like? Is that daybreak on June 6th?
Right.
What was the situation like?
Well, we had quite a few of our people were around there, but we didn't have any of the equipment bundles that had the machine guns or the mortars. So we just had riflemen. And the roads were all bounded by hedgerows on each side, so they were sort of sunken roads. And it made it difficult to find out where the Germans were. And they had the intersections pretty well covered with the machine gun fire and mortar fire. So moving around was pretty risky. And Bob and I started rounding up casualties, and we used a farm cart to transport the wounded that couldn't walk. And we had one of the first casualties that I took care of was a man named Luce. And he had gotten a whole burst of machine gun fire in his right arm. It was just shredded. And by the time I got up to help him, he had pretty well bled out. There was a large pool of blood in the ditch beside him. I put a tourniquet on and gave him a shot of morphine. And there was a lot of firing going on. Machine gun had just nailed him. So I had a piece of parachute silk, and I put him on that parachute silk and dragged him down the road to where I could get him into the cart. And I took him back to the church. He died that afternoon. We couldn't stop the bleeding. Another man was wounded. A bullet went through his helmet and grazed his scalp and knocked a chunk of bone out. And there's an artery that supplies blood to the head, and every time his heart pumped, a squirt of blood came out. And we tried, but we couldn't get it. The bleeding stopped, and he bled to death. We lost two of them that afternoon.
And did you know those guys from the training?
Yeah, I wasn't close to either of them, but they were both in D Company, and I was a medic in D Company, and so I knew them to say hello to, and they were good men, nice guys.
During this time, the residents of Angoville, what were they doing?
I didn't see them. I don't know what they were doing. I don't think they had cellars, but they were hiding out. We wound up. They brought us a little girl that was wounded, and we put her in the church and bandaged her up and gave her a shot of morphine. But the civilians weren't around. We didn't see any of them.
There was when did the first wounded German arrive in the church, and was it a German officer who asked you to care for the soldier?
That was in the evening that the Germans came in. They were wounded there when the sun came up, and there were some jump casualties, broken legs and back injuries, and then the combat casualties. But they trickled in, and then we went out, and the ones that couldn't walk, we went out and got them in the cart and brought them back into the church. And by the time the sun went down, our officers came in and told us that they couldn't hold the church, that they were going to have to pull back. And they wanted one of us to stay with the wounded. So Bob and I looked at each other and said, we better both stay. So our people pulled back, and shortly after dark, 3 Germans came in the door of the church, and they were German paratroopers. And they all stood there with submachine guns. And several of our people had 45 automatics under their parachute cover. And I was really concerned that they were going to take a shot at the Germans, and that would have been Dodge City. But nobody did, and the German, one of them could speak English. And I told him that we didn't have an office, we didn't have a doctor, and we had a couple of German casualties in there. And so he looked around and said that he would get a doctor in for us as soon as he could, probably in the morning. But he said they wouldn't bother us, they would leave us alone. And they went out, they set up a machine gun right outside the front door of the church, and they clattered around their hobnail boots most of the night. In the morning when the sun came up, there was a lot of machine gun firing. And I peeked out the window of the church. The church walls were about a foot thick. And I peeked out the window of the church, and there was an American tank out there, and he was firing through the windows. So somebody went out and climbed up on the tank and told him that that was an American aid station. And so shortly after that, some trucks came up from the beach, and they evacuated the wounded down to Utah Beach.
I'm going to pause it here a moment. When the Germans arrived, how many Americans wounded and how many German wounded do you think you had in the church?
We had 2 Germans, and it's difficult to remember. I would guess we had 40 or 50 American wounded, and it might have been more than that, but that's the church was packed with casualties. And
did you have any idea during this time, especially after the Germans, after your comrades had fallen back and then the Germans had come into the town, did you have any concerns or ideas about how the battle plan was going, whether you were winning or losing or what?
Well, I was exhausted. I was recovering from yellow jaundice, and I was weak to start with. So by the time those Germans showed up, I figured it was just about over. But I can't remember what I felt like. It was really a tense situation.
And I assume that you and probably everybody were kind of scared about what was going to happen.
Yeah, I don't recall my feelings at the time. There was an awful lot going on. The Germans were clattering around with their hobnail boots outside the yard, and it seemed to me that we were going to be PWs, that we had been captured. And
if I could ask you a little bit more about the wounded that were there, how serious were the wounds, or minor were the wounds, and was it stuff that you recovered through your medic training to treat, or were you in over your heads? What was that like?
We trained mainly in first aid, and our training and our job essentially was to stop the bleeding and administer morphine for pain, and bandage up the casualties as best we could and get them back to the aid station. We weren't trained or capable of doing any surgical techniques, and we did the best we could, but in the case of Luce and Johnson, why it was inadequate. They probably would have been saved if they'd gotten into a situation like a MASH unit in Korea, but they didn't, and so they bled to death. And there were quite a few penetrating wounds from rifle fire, and a few shrapnel wounds, and quite a few broken legs and dings from the parachute jump. We didn't have any plasma. We didn't. On the jump, we had medical supply bags that were dropped, but we weren't able to recover any of those. So all we had was the aid kit that we had dropped with. And each soldier had a little first aid kit with a bandage and a syringe of morphine. And so we used that primarily to try to stop the bleeding on the wounds.
Okay. I apologize. I have to pause here for a couple of minutes. All right. Picking up. Getting back to being inside the church, that I suppose the wounded you started up having them on the floor or on the pews, or how did that work?
We tried to, the ones that were pretty badly wounded, we got into the pews, and the rest of them were sitting in the pews and up on the altar. It's not a very big church.
And who came up with the proviso that the weapons should be left outside the church?
Bob.
And why?
Well, he wanted it to be an aid station, and not if the Germans came in, why they wouldn't consider it a fighting situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you were telling me when the camera was off about how the church took some artillery hits. What was that like?
Oh, about late in the afternoon, I was puttering around in the church, and I took my helmet off, and I was standing in the middle of the church, and all of a sudden there's a big crash, and a mortar shell hit the roof of the church, and a big chunk of plaster came down and banged me in the scalp and split my scalp open. Wasn't really a serious wound, but it bled quite a bit. That's what I got my Purple Heart.
Really? Really? That's where you got a Purple Heart?
Yeah. I was embarrassed to take it, but at the end of the war, you got points for any decoration, and I needed points to get home soon. So I had him give me a Purple Heart.
Could you tell me at what point and how, what was the most hectic and nerve-wracking nerve-wracking point during that day or so?
They told us that there was a casualty about 100 yards away from the church that had a serious leg wound. And so Bob and I both went out to get him. And we stood him up and put an armor on each of our shoulders. And we walked him back to the church. And there's a courtyard, or not a courtyard, but an area out in front of the church, a big, wide area that we had to cross. And the Germans were on our left and the Americans were over on our right, and they were firing back and forth across this area. So I told Bob, I said, get your armband out where they can see it. And we walked out and everybody stopped firing, and we staggered across the plaza there and into the church, and then the firing picked up again. But that was probably the most hectic event of the day for me.
Well, let me ask you, I'm sorry, I want to make one minor adjustment. Please don't move. We're just going to move your coffee right back over here. That must have been a unique sensation, that for the moment that you were out there, that the war just stopped for a few moments.
Yeah. The Germans were pretty good about not shooting at medics. There were several times they could have shot me, but they didn't. And we didn't shoot at the German medics, so it was sort of agreement.
These all the questions that I've been asking you about this in particulars. These memories are still so vivid.
Yes. Yep. When I went back to France in 2004, I retraced the area that we worked in on D-Day, and it still looks the same. A lot of the hedgerows are gone, but the little roads and the farmhouses and everything are still the way they were 60 years ago.
And you were in the church and dealing with the wounded at that specific place for how long?
Day and a half. All through the 6th and halfway into the next day.
Did you lose track of time during any of that? Just one thing after another?
No, I didn't lose track of time, but it seemed like things moved rather quickly, and there's civilians say that soldiers don't want to talk about their experiences, and that's really not true. We just don't know how to express it. There's no substitute for hearing a bullet snap past your head and you realize that someone's trying to kill you. And you can't explain or put into words how that feels. But it forever changes you. You're never quite the same.
Your supply situation, at any point did you start to run low on your morphine and first aid stuff, or what?
We were just about used up when they came up from the beach. Fortunately, each man had a bandage and a morphine syringe. So we had jumped with our aid kits, and we had quite a bit of equipment that we carried. So we didn't run out, but it was getting close.
Did you ever feel that the church was going to collapse during the bombardment or anything like that?
No, it was pretty solid. Those old French buildings were fortresses.
Let me do a quick. I have to change something. With when you and Mr. Wright were working, tending the wounded, were you working together as a team or individually? How was? Do you remember any of that?
Pretty much individually. We checked on the wounded to try to control the bleeding, and we tried to give them some food. We had K rations, and we tried to make sure that everybody had a chance to have a meal.
Do you remember any kind of things that you were saying with Mr. Wright during this time?
Bob was in better shape than I was. I as I said, I was coming off a yellow jaundice, so I was quite weak. And Bob was a sturdy little guy, and I think he was probably more affected than I was as far as handling the casualties.
Did you, since you had German wounded and American in the same place, was there any discussion about keeping them separated or treating them one way or another? How did you?
No, no, I don't believe there was any real animosity expressed. They weren't, as I recall, they weren't badly hurt. They had largely superficial wounds, and I don't recall anybody wanting to shoot him or anything.
Even among the wounded that were there?
No, that's what I mean. Our people had guns, and nobody that I recall expressed any desire to kill him.
Basically treated them as one professional with another, and
yeah, just they were young men, much like us, except they were wearing a different uniform.
And when the troops, when the town was retaken, what can you remember about that?
Well, a big sense of relief. Many of the casualties we had needed attention. They needed to be seen by a doctor. So that was the big relief for me, was that these guys would be taken down to the beach and get professional attention.
When you look back on the time when you and Robert were in there and providing the help, it's hard to ask this, but just like what was the general mood of the men towards what you were able to do, even regarding how limited you had the help that you could offer them? Some of the men.
They were all grateful for the help that they were getting and relieved that they were still alive. And they did the best they could to help, and realized that it was a difficult situation, and they all did the best they could under the circumstances.
When you went back and you saw the monument, what did you think of that? Jumping ahead several decades.
I thought that was amazing, and that was going to be there for foreseeable future, and that Bob and I, just a couple of privates in the service, got recognition that I don't believe we deserved, but that's the way it was. And I thought that was pretty nice. I was grateful to Hubert Acton, the man that put it all together.
When you went into the church and you saw that there were still stains on the pews, what was your reaction?
I remembered how they got there. That's it's difficult for me to express it, but I think the reason it's gotten attention now is that we weren't involved in killing. We weren't trigger pullers. I tell my grandchildren my role in the war. I was there sort of an observer. I wasn't a rifleman killing people, and I was there in one of the big historical events of our century. D-Day is a given. You say D-Day to someone, they know what you're talking about. And I was there, and I got a front row seat, and it was pretty unique.
I guess one last thing I'd just like to ask is that your sons and grandchildren have followed your footsteps into the service, and that your sons, if you could just tell me briefly that your sons went on and they enlisted in the 101st as well.
They both enlisted in Vietnam. They both volunteered for the parachute school, and they wound up in the 101st, which is the same division that I was in. And I was very proud of them. I told them when they enlisted not to go in the parachute troops, that they should go in the Air Force or the Navy, where they would have a career, but they wanted to follow in my footsteps, and I'm quite proud of them for that.
Is there anything I haven't asked that you would like to say?
No, it's impossible to tell people now what the mood of the country was in World War II. Vietnam was a difficult period, and a lot of our young people went to Canada or went to great lengths to avoid service, but that didn't happen in World War II. Everybody pitched in, and particularly young men. We were afraid we were going to miss it, so we all wanted to get there. It was the great adventure, and it surely was.
I think that does it.
What's the red flashing light?
Oh, that just means it's recording.
All the time. So Mike grew up with those stories, and Mike has shared them with Sam. and Sam just takes it in like a sponge.
In fact, in
knows.
the 3rd or 4th grade or something, they had to drew a little book, with crayons. And other kids would do. One kid do on the history of candy, and another girl on flowers. He did it on the history of World War II. And the teacher said the amazing thing was that he had all of his dates right.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
He had all of.
Really good people got killed, and I didn't think he was going to make it, but he did.
That must.
For a year, good guys.
And these are the ones who could care less about
Yeah,
war.
the twins.
The twins are these two.
Oh, let's see.
That one.
He was being trained for the invasion of Japan. And he was being...
Yeah, the people that are upset about the atom bomb
Oh.
weren't sitting on an island waiting to
Yeah.
invade Japan.
Yeah. He's in be a 1/4 of a mile inland. And he thought, you've got 8 waves with 5,000 men per wave, and you're only going to be a 1/4 of a mile in. This doesn't look good. That looks like a British.
It is.
Oh, it is? Did they give you that, or did you collect it?
No, I went over to the British division when we were in England for.
He loves all the different insignias and medals.
I had quite a bit of stuff, and I don't have anything that.
Where would is Mr. Wright in this photograph also?
Oh gosh, let me.
If not,
That's quite an institution too, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And
The West Point of the South.
yeah.
Sure, yeah. Only if it's not too much effort.
Oh no, it's no problem. It's I'll put it over here, and you can.
Okay.
You can. Oh, come on.
Well, I'll take care of
Mike
that.
can
I'll
arrange
set it up.
just-
Yeah, I'll take care of that. Yeah, perfect. I can arrange that.
Good. She's started her mother started, then her mother died and she took over, but Valley, and they got in with some heavy hitters and raised some real important money.
That's remarkable.
And she's got a photographer like Mike with her. Yes, I do. They're my daughter was a real powerhouse. It really tore me up when she died.
I can't imagine.
Funny.
How is the food over there wonderful? Did you enjoy or not?
Not really.
Really?
We stayed.
I think our expectations are so high.
Well, yeah. If you're expecting a gourmet meal,
Yeah.
I think you're lucky
To get a
to
meal.
find one.